The session is called Words Are All We Have. Two writers, a poet, a translator, speak about ways of seeing and recording and how they navigate words across countries and cultures. We have a poet and author, Eleni Sikelianos.
Not easy. Sikelianos.
It's Eleni. And she's the author of 8 books of poetry, most recently Make Yourself Happy, and of 2 hybrid memoirs. She's received many awards for poetry, non-fiction, translations, including 2 National Endowment of the Arts Awards and the National Poetry Series. Her work has been translated into no less than 20 languages, and this fall she joined the Literary Art faculty at Brown University. And next to her we have young Kanishk Tharoor, who is a writer and broadcaster. He's the author of a short story collection called Swimmer Among the Stars, which has received a huge amount of critical attention, and which, when I read it again recently, I was astounded by the range of the perspectives of the stories from. It's something worth reading. He's also the presenter of the BBC radio series Museum of Lost Objects, and writes for lots of newspapers, which I will not list out here. And then we have Paulo Lemos Horta, who's the author of Marvelous Thieves, Secret Authors of the Arabian Nights, and the co-editor, along with Bruce Robbins, of Cosmopolitanisms. He's associate professor at New York University in Abu Dhabi. So I'm going to ask, to begin with, some questions, all 3 of them, and then some individual questions and some readings. The first question I pose to you all is, can you recall your earliest memory of wanting to be a writer, whatever form that might take? Poetry, memoir, fiction, non-fiction. Actually, this word non-fiction drives me mad. I don't know what it is, why they call things non-fiction. I mean, I'm anyway very confused. What is fiction, what is not fiction? But when did you decide that words were going to be your primary medium of expression? I think we'll begin that way now. Paulo.
Thank you. The earliest stories that I was told actually as a child by my mother were Ali Baba and Aladdin. And my mother was an orphan growing up in the north of Brazil. The first book she received from her adopted father was the Arabian Nights. And she remembers the adult sort of version that it was. It wasn't a kid's illustrated edition. My parents had lived in the Middle East before I was born. So I have to confess, I hope this is not being taped, but there is footage of me, you know, surrounded by objects from the Middle East, pretending to be Aladdin, and I think that that really was those were the first stories that I was making up. The first sequels and franchises I was dreaming of were in fact Ali Baba and Aladdin, which is why many years later, I've been intrigued by the knowledge that these stories didn't have originals in Arabic, and they had a very mysterious origin. So there's a connection to the book.
Hi everybody, thank you all for coming first thing in the morning. It's a pleasure to be here in Boulder. I had the great privilege of growing up in a household that was full of books. My mother is a professor of literature, and my father was a writer as well. So we had lots and lots of books around the house, and for me, I always felt that writing was a helpless kind of activity, that it was something that you know, you did naturally. And so as from a young age, I would write little stories. We were also, my brother and I, who's a writer himself and sitting in the back of the room, we were read to, you know, from a really young age, all sorts of stories. My mother was like quite deliberately eclectic in the way she raised us, so she would read to us from sort of abridged versions of the Bible, as well as from the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. And we also had the sort of realms of Enid Blyton and other kinds of children's tales. So we were saturated with all sorts of material. And you know, I remember when on my parents' old blue screen WordPerfect desktop, banging out little short stories about, I mean, they were, I was you know, like an eight-year-old boy, so they were invariably a little bit bloody and militaristic. But banging out short stories like that on that old blue screen. And that's, I mean, it's such a, it sounds a little bit trite to say, but that's where it began.
Well, I must tell the audience that Kanishk's father was a friend of mine. I was at around the same age, and so when he was 12, he wrote his first novel, which was published in the Junior Statesman. And it was also quite bloody and military. It was a World War II kind of novel, if I remember. What about
Diplomacy has won since.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, likewise, I remember trying to write stories at about 7, different generations on my mother's IBM Selectric. At the same time, so I knew then that I wanted to try writing, and mine were more about purple fog engulfing nations, and I should have, I guess I was probably influenced also by Purple Haze. But it actually didn't seem very possible in my background to become a writer. I lived in, I was in Section 8 housing on food stamps, and I couldn't figure out how that would work. And I didn't know that there were living poets either, so I thought I would be a fiction writer. It wasn't until I was hitchhiking around Greece and I picked up a book of modern Greek poets, which happened to have poems by my great-grandfather in them, and that was sort of an awakening that poetry was a possibility. And I realized I just didn't have a narrative mind. I did not have a normal narrative mind. Poetry was possible. But I also, when I think about the things that influenced me early, I remember phrases like, "Do you mind? Do you mind?" And when I was 4 years old, I thought, well, yes, of course I mind my mother. But the person saying it was saying it in this tone that was irritated, and they wanted me to move out of the way. Do you mind? So I think about those kinds of phrases that mean several different things possibly, and the way that language cleaves, even the word cleave, between two meanings, and in a way that's so much of what poetry is, this proliferation of possibility of meaning. But also, even in that early phrase that I puzzled over for so long, questions of voice and tone, and how that imparts meaning.
I'd love to know a little more about your grandfather, who was the poet that you mentioned.
Yes, so my great-grandfather was a Greek poet, very, very...
Name?
Eleni Sikelianos, very recognized in Greece. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize. He was very close friends with Nikos Kazantzakis. When I first traveled to Greece, I was constantly given gifts on behalf of my great-grandfather. Kilos of grapes to carry along, and amazing, amazing. It's changed somewhat, but he was a very revered poet. I was a little cut off from that lineage because it was my paternal lineage, and I didn't grow up with my father, so I had to rediscover that lineage.
And what was the first poem of his you encountered, and how did you react to it?
Well, I have to be completely frank. It was actually the other Greek poets in the book I responded to more. But he has a very beautiful poem called "The Sacred Way" about he was a great walker, and he walked from Athens to Eleusis, you know, where the sacred mysteries were, and he met a gypsy family and a dancing bear along the way, and this poem describes that encounter. It's beautiful.
From there, I want to move about, we are talking about words and language. You pay close attention to it with your writing. So I want to know how your relationship with words has changed over time. Once you have become professional writers, once it's almost the mission of your life. Has your relationship with words changed from that early encounter? A quick question. A quick reply if you're all puzzled by this.
Well, I mean, let me answer it in two ways. My own writing tends to be, or aspires to be lyrical. So I do really that. And in the literature I enjoy reading, I am often reading for language as well. I like that kind of thing. I like rich language. But at the same time, as a young writer, when I began writing short stories or slightly aborted novels when I was really young. I wrote in this slightly purple, over-the-top way, wearing all sorts of influences very, very clearly. But I think over time, my writing I've had to discipline myself. I've become naturally more concise, economic. But I think, that for me has been, I suppose, the evolution of my relationship with words. But I do really think that that the pleasure I derive both from writing and reading boils a lot down to the pleasure of enjoying good language.
How many languages do you speak and how many do you read?
Well, I can read a number of languages, about 4 or 5 languages.
List out which ones?
Okay, so I can read French, Spanish, English, Farsi, and Hindi.
I'm very modest.
But I particularly enjoy reading Old English. But when it comes to having a practical conversation or buying a cup of tea, I might be much less efficient than in those languages.
Thank you. Paulo, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, as a trained scholar, and in the bowels of the archives, and expected to produce a certain kind of academic prose. Academic prose has been described as one of those globes, those Christmas globes, because it's supposed to be able to deflect any kind of criticism. So you're supposed to say pretty much something which can't be contradicted, but that's also another way of saying nothing. And I had this epiphany. I was writing something for an art catalog. There was a huge exhibit in Paris celebrating the 300 years of the Arabian Nights in the European literature, and the commission was to write something very narrative. So I just started off by writing about this mysterious traveler arriving, a merchant named Abdullah arriving in Alexandria on his way to the Hajj. But in fact, he was hiding the fact that he didn't want to be taken for a convert. His name was actually not Abdullah, it was actually Richard Burton, the explorer. And it just so happened, this was about 4 years ago, and it just so happened that there was Bill Germano, this great book doula or book magician, was in town at my university, and he was early for my appointment. My office was open, and he read this article I wrote, which was, I have to admit, it had been translated into French, and it sounded a lot better than my original. And then he said, you should write your whole book like this. And that's basically what I did. I wrote a very narrative book, surrounded by scholars saying, oh, that's not going to work out for you very well. Are you sure you want to do that? Why can't you just produce another globe of jargon? So yeah, I think my relationship has changed a lot.
So Eleni, I'll carry over the question into my further question for you, because now I'm going to ask each of you a specific sort of, not a question, but some pointers, and ask you to do a reading also. So, your relationship with words is very dynamic, and you bring in a lot of visuals and images as well. So tell us about that. I'm going to quote some things here. You've written, one of the things I was thinking about in writing this book, and maybe culture making in general, has become preservationist act. It feels very different from those outrider poets, 20th century and beyond, who needed to tear things down. Then you've said that you have a desire to reclaim the pleasure of the poem, the hedonistic experience of sound and light and movement as they rush through language in that sensorial buoyancy that for me is singular to poetry, to celebrate and to sing. So, this is clearly a part of your relationship with words. You've been called that strange thing, an experimental poet, fluid quality to your reading. So if you tell us about this and then do a short reading, it would be very good.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's probably related to the way my relationship with language has changed too, because as a young poet, I very much dwelled in the sensory and the sensual aspects of language, sound and rhythm and all of those things that are so amazing in what a poem can do. I think very, very, prose can do it too, but poetry does it in a different way, partly because of that line break. And I think one of the things that happens as you accrue knowledge in the world, you see how language is being used to deceive publicly. And so that when you're a poet and you're thinking about, you're so excited about sound and proliferation of meaning, and then you see language being used to inveigle us or to outright lie, it really shakes the core belief in language. And so I feel that I have to constantly re-anchor myself in a belief in language and what language can do, and also in the pleasure of what language can do. And I think because as writers, as poets, part of our job is to wake us up, to remind us to be attentive to all the dangers that are happening in the world. But sometimes it begins to seem that we're reenacting grief all the time. So how can the poem also still be in zones of pleasure, I guess? And we need all of that range of things, of course. We don't want to just do one or the other. So those are things I think about.
Do you want to read something?
Sure, yeah.
Whatever you read, okay. Yeah,
Please tell me what to read.
That one.
This one's okay.
Words.
Not this one? Actually, maybe I'll start. So this book is in 3 sections, and the interview that Namita was quoting is about this book, and in particular about this balance. One section is devoted to animals that have gone extinct in modern times, and then others are devoted to notions of how we make ourselves happy, and the very basic question. I wanted to return to basic questions: how to live. And I'll just read a poem from the middle section, and then we'll see if there's time for another. And this is called Entheogen Chorus. It's the ghost dance of all the animals beating earth with their hooves. It's the black crow dance of reality, purge. The who me bubble out front, golden popping who me bubble. Reality keeps throwing up her circus tents, plays a little song on the harmonica to accompany herself out. Swish, swish. Reality's really dirty. Even its roosters are making me laugh. Everybody's hoarding, everybody's barfing up the world's extra energy, throwing up reality. So the animals' ghost dance is what we get. They will never be done dancing if we wipe them from the face of the earth. They will never be done being part of it, making the world with their sounds and feet and hooves, until they are done dancing the animals' ghost dance, and then they will be done. Okay, maybe a less dark one. Yeah, talking about all, yes, we can't, let's not be so dark.
Not so happy.
Yes, I know. Well, it was partly that connection between our pursuits of happiness and the outcome, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is from the earlier section. Beauty rolling around in the dust, an incandescence between what wanders around among coming to be and decay. It's only human. It's like the children's riddle about the eunuch who threw something at a bat. A happiness that is not happy throws a shoe that is not a shoe out the window, not a window, toward the moon, not a moon. Till the echo between moon and not moon made its own mooing called song. So, with so many bigs and smalls and lights and heavies, we describe our happy, our pain. Apply these names in accordance with the beasts. What it enjoys, good. What angers it, bad. You are the beast. Be happy. Thank you so much for having me read.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Kanishk now. In your interviews you've said, I'm drawn to lyrical writing. If you put a gun to my head, which I'm not doing, and said Faulkner or Hemingway, it would be Faulkner every day. These pieces of fiction may not be intervening in a contemporary policy debate, but I do think every piece in my collection is exploring what we would call a political issue, whether it's notions of identity, notions of power relations, or ways of seeing in the world. And your book, Swimmer Among the Stars, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful stories about language that I've ever read. You explore so many different themes in those different stories that it's difficult, except for the style, but it's difficult to imagine that the same person is imagining through so many eyes and perspectives. So you've said there are political issues, there's stuff about refugees, displacement, destruction, war, climate change. I don't necessarily hope people will come away feeling motivated for action. But if people think about those real world themes in a more concerted or even slightly different way, that would be good too. So tell us about this process of using lyrical crafted language to express urgent and political views. And maybe if you want to read first and then talk about it, or if you want to, whichever order you want.
Sure, I'll just, that quote I think came when I was asked quite directly about how politics works in my fiction. And in many of these stories there are, as I mentioned, the political ideas and themes, but I don't know if I necessarily write them as in so intentional a way. There's this, I did mention Old English before, so I guess I can bring this up, but there's this wonderful Old English word which didn't survive into modern English, called dustsherovan, which literally translates, I guess, into the contemplation of dust. And it's the closest sort of word we have in modern English to that is nostalgia. And doesn't have the same sort of fullness that the Old English word does. I mean, the Old English word dushevan, it has in it an awareness of the way the past persists into the present. Nostalgia is backward facing. And I think a lot of my fiction is really about that. It's about this awareness of the traces of the past, of narratives that have been submerged, of things that have fallen by the wayside. Including, and I'll read from the story about language, which is a story about language extinction.
But there's also a story about, a futuristic story about the United Nations circling in a satellite or something like that.
Yeah, there's a slightly futuristic story there too.
But I would love it if you talked a little about language.
Sure.
And the cinema.
Yeah, so we live in, many of you may know that we live in a time of unprecedented language loss. Now, I have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with what that means, or the question of whether it's a good or bad thing, because we don't want to say that a language determines a culture, that a language determines who people are. But in any case, we are losing a lot of languages now for many reasons. And by the end of this century, we have lost 50% of the world's languages. Interestingly, I'm going to read from a story that's set in a remote mountain valley that I've been to, but I don't name in the story itself. And it's about a meeting between a team of anthropologists who are recording dying languages and the supposed last speaker of this language. And though it takes place seemingly far away from our urban Western world, actually, the reason I got into language extinction was because I live in New York City, which is a sort of laboratory of dying languages. Over 800 languages are spoken in New York City, many of which are languages spoken in diaspora in New York that are no longer spoken in parts of Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in Kenya, and so forth, but they survive in immigrant communities in New York City. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And there are good people, underfunded, if I may say, doing wonderful work, going about finding and recording these voices. Really amazing stuff. In any case, I'll read from a section of that story, which I think might touch on everything we've discussed. Eleni was talking about how, you know, it's, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I thought it was wonderful how you were saying that, you know, there can be so much loss and struggle with language that it's also important to try to find pleasure there too. And the protagonist of this story is very much engaged in that project. She's trying to recover. She doesn't want to feel that her language is a stagnant, dead thing. So this is in the midst of her interview with these anthropologists. "I'm much obliged to you," she says. "I'm very grateful that you have come here to see me and let me feel old in my language." She means it too. Sorry. That's right. To whom else can she pass this inheritance? Her children may have known a handful of words when they were young, but their mother's tongue was always too much of a responsibility. They would come home from the fields or the houses of their friends or from school and look at their mother with a kind of fatigue, as if her language was another chore, as tedious as dishes. She thought about making a more concerted effort to teach them, but where could she begin? As far as she knew, her language was not something that was ever taught. How could she explain its quixotic use of tenses, its habit of piling on suffixes to verbs, its wealth of nouns, when she had no knowledge of all that herself? Her ability was only intuitive, the work of habit, not understanding. In their classrooms, her children would go to the blackboard and write out conjugations in the common language. They memorized ditties that helped explain the subjunctive and mnemonics that guided correct spelling. Against this ordered system of rules, her own language seemed amorphous, entirely shapeless. What was allowed and what wasn't, she wondered. When her father sang his songs, or when her sisters gossiped about the grocer in front of him, could it have been that in speaking they had often misspoken? She didn't begrudge the fact that her children eventually shed what language she had given them. How were they to know that the babble of their mother was a language at all? Her son now farms in his wife's town on the other side of the valley, not far, but far away enough that he does not see his mother often. Her daughter was always the cleverer of the two, destined for the city and its indispensable comforts: air conditioning, coffee, the admiring glances of strangers. Every month, her daughter sends her some money. They speak often on the phone, and their conversations are loving and repetitive, as all loving conversations should be. She is proud that neither of her children is vulnerable to false nostalgia, that they find full satisfaction in the present of their lives. "In my language," she tells the ethnographers, "words for gratitude are much different than in the common speech. We have many kinds. This, for instance, is used to express a very dark kind of gratitude, to be thankful for the loss of something. This means to be grateful despite yourself, with a hint of bitterness. This is used to describe a sudden, overwhelming feeling of gratitude. This is the feeling children have when they receive small gifts like sweets, or when they are lifted by an adult and spun and spun." The ethnographers take notes. Nobody ever compiled a complete grammar or lexicon of the language, so part of their mission is to attempt to reconstruct the language in its fullness. They will never know that in her language there were more than a dozen ways of indicating and describing gratitude. Here are a few more. The gratitude of natural things for one another, like the hive for the branch, the tree for the bees, the cloud for the sun. Collective gratitude, the thanks of a family or a town or a people. Gratitude directed to the cosmos for superiority, for knowing that one is better than everybody else. The gratitude of one safe from death by starvation. Her language boasted many verbs for which no simple equivalents exist in the common language. For example, this means to be afraid of seeing time pass. This means to tell bedtime stories in the depths of winter. This is the action of stirring a kind of gravy in a pot. This also denotes the motion of a pig rooting around in the mud. This refers to the way light splinters against a range of mountains at dusk. This describes in one word how mountains gain mass and shape at dawn. This means to feel strange in an unfamiliar place. This means to be patient for spring, as does this and this. I'll stop there.
Intensely moving. Thank you. Words are all we have. And made me think. I come from in the Himalayas in India, and we speak a dialect called Pahari, Kumaoni. And our unique thing is that we have 22 words for bad smell. Not so poetic, but different sorts of categories of bad smells. We won't go into it. I don't understand why it happens, because it's actually the most beautiful sort of place in the world, with snow mountains, blue skies, monsoon. I think it's the long monsoons and the damp smells that creep out of that. Now, I am moving to Paulo. Let me quote. I know that these reviews from the net can sometimes be a bit distorted or of a particular moment, but it's a good way to open into the thing. So the review of your latest book, Marvelous Thieves, it says, Marvelous Thieves recovers the cross-cultural encounters, collaborations, borrowings, and acts of literary larceny that produce the Arabian Nights in European languages. And you've already given a beautiful talk about it here, but do tell us about this remaking of the Arabian Nights and your impulse towards this project, the idea behind it. And one of my questions was, what is your relationship with the Arabian Nights? Did you read it as a child? And you just told us that. So, I mean, it is, also, I'd love to know about what you feel about the relationship of the Arabian Nights and those interconnected stories with similar traditions in India that it is supposed to have also derived from, like the Katha Sarit Sagar. So, tell us all that you know about all this. And if you want to read first, you're most welcome, and if you want to read later, whichever feels better. We have lots of time.
I think I'll start by telling you everything I know about the Arabian Nights. How many people here have read Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves? Or maybe you've heard of Sinbad and none of these stories exist in the original collections of the Arabian Nights. This blew my mind when I discovered this. This was a panel about the power of words to create worlds, right? And the translators of the Arabian Nights into French and English only had about 40 stories, or 282 nights. Shahrazad would have died very soon. And they had to make up their stories elsewhere. They did borrow from Indian sagas and from Persian collections and even Greek stories, fittingly enough. But for 300 years, we have given the credit to these Orientalists who traveled. Antoine Galland, the first European translator who was French, had traveled to Istanbul. So we imagined that he made up the remainder of the stories that he needed from his own experiences in the palaces of Topkapi and elsewhere. And the famous Richard Burton, who I spoke about, who performed the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina in disguise as a Muslim, and of course Edward Lane, who lived as a Muslim in Cairo and who believed in jinn. But as Eleni was as Eleni reminded us, the worlds that we create with words can deceive us. And these Orientalists, by not crediting where they took these stories from, were engaging in an act of deception. They were feeding the hunger, of course, of Europe for the luxury goods of the East. You know, the court in Versailles before the revolution is what produced this first translation of the Arabian Nights, with its first for these, you know, gigantic jewels and all that. In fact, what my research shows that that the stories that were added were taken from storytellers from Aleppo, booksellers in Cairo, munshis, you know, language teachers in Mumbai. Even the commentaries that the Orientalist translators are so proud, these philological, you know, comparisons with Old English, you know, it turns out in their notebooks they acknowledge that they borrowed these from these interlocutors. So these are the secret authors of my book. So I think what I'll do, instead of reading, not to compete with the poet and such a fine, elegant, I'll pass my book around if you want to take a look at it. I'll just tell you a story. I think that's more in the spirit
Even better.
of the Arabian Nights, since the stories were, of course, told orally. Let me just tell you a story about who actually contributed the story of Aladdin to the Arabian Nights. So let me tell you about Hana Diab. Hana Diab was born in the late 1600s, and he was the youngest of 4 or 5 brothers in a very modest household, Christian Maronites in Aleppo in Syria. Aleppo was this marvelous place of encounter between East and West. It was on the Silk Road. Stories traveled both ways. Hana evidently had a passion for these stories, but he was supposed to become a monk, or he was supposed to become a merchant. He tried being a monk. He went to a monastery, and then he was shocked to see his reflection in the mirror when he had shaved his head. And the first meal that he had in the monastery consisted of watching the older monks getting beaten as an example to the novices, and then people would pick up the craniums, the skulls of the dead monks, and tell stories about them. So he ran away from the monastery. He used to love to sneak into the cafes in Aleppo. There were over 60 Christians, Jews, and Muslims got together and listened to stories together. And that's why the Maronites were told to stay away, because maybe they would hear something bad about themselves, from these other peoples. But Hana would sneak into this place. And he always dreamt of going elsewhere. And indeed what happened is he came across, he snuck out again from Aleppo, because his older brothers would get all these opportunities to apprentice with the merchants, with the French merchants of Aleppo, but he would not, he was too young. And he came across a con man, a marvelous thief, Paul Lucas, who collected curiosities for the king's cabinet. You could find in his apartment in the guidebooks of Paris. This was before there was an Egyptian museum or the Louvre, right? And it was a palace. And Paul Lucas's apartment was riddled with curiosities. But the greatest curiosities he ever brought from the Middle East was Hana Diab. And basically what happened is that Paul Lucas was famous for exploding little pyramids because he was very impatient in seeking out his curiosities and his antiquities. And he brought Hana Diab to Versailles, and he presented him to the king, and he dressed him up, and he said, "Wear your Maronite robes." And so Hana brought out his ceremonial Maronite robes. And then Paul Lucas said, no, you're not Oriental enough. Put on this Egyptian headdress, and hold these exotic animals and perform this kind of Orientalism. And here's what really blew me away in my research. We've imagined for 300 years that the French translator had traveled to Topkapi, and that's where Aladdin's palace came from. But now that we have the memoir from the storyteller from Aleppo, Hana Diab, I realized that it was in fact Hana Diab's vision of Versailles, which had been recently built. Louis XIV had built Versailles, and he had asked for the palace to be built like no other, and that's exactly what Aladdin asks the jinn to do in the story. And that completely changes the way we think of these stories. Arabists have been asking us to cut out Aladdin and Ali Baba because they were added in French, and they were French inventions. Turns out they were actually told by a Syrian Maronite. We should put them back into the Arabian Nights. And we should realize that Hana was marveling at Versailles and not an Orientalist at Topkapi. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
What an extraordinary set of stories. It was, I thought I'll do one question to all of you if you feel like, and then we can open it out to the audience. I wanted to ask you about the place that the written word occupies in the world today, because the visual is replacing the significance of the written word in many places. Instagram is a language most people can read if they can get the cultural cues right. Social media, Facebook. Eleni, of course, uses photos, paintings, drawings, maps, documents. But what about both of you? What do you feel is, well, you've told us your relationship with language, for example, Kanishk, but where do each of you think language is going? Okay. Let's give it the odds.
Ouch.
Yeah.
I can start with ouch, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a. I feel both despair and hope, I guess I would say, and I mean, in particular in this country, where I feel we're losing a sense of right at the very top, literateness. And there was that whole trickle-down theory. It's true. It works in this case when there seems to be very little interest in culture making, language use in an artful way at the top, and I think that has repercussions. I see, on the other hand, among my students, and I notice it maybe more profoundly with the undergrads because the graduate students have already made a commitment to language, but they're hungry. They're hungry for the kind of contemplation that a poem or literature can provide, and that makes me hopeful.
I would definitely echo that last point. I mean, I try as much as possible to minimize my time on social media, and I'm sure it eats away from the patience and the intellectual space that people have to sink into a book. But I think that there always will be a need for that immersion, whether into a poem or into a novel or into short stories or whatever it is. I don't think that's going to go away. I do think, though, that writers face a lot of competition. Not only are you competing against everybody writing now and everybody who's written for the last 3,000, 4,000 years, you're also competing against TV and film, and especially TV. My wife's a poet, and I'm writing fiction. And we spend probably way too much time watching TV because TV is so good these days. And so I think we have to be realistic about how much a novel can really capture people's attention as opposed the way it might have 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But I also think that means that so I'm beginning teaching some creative writing, and I try to encourage my students to think why they want to write fiction. And I think, as opposed to, say, making some other working in any other kind of genre, especially in TV, because Lord knows they make so much more money that way. But and I think a lot of that has to do with the pleasure of language. And that, there's a certain kind of, inbuilt in American letters is a kind of, real, maybe slightly over-egged respect for transparent prose and sort of and the idea that the prose just needs to be like a window. I think that we need to really return to the sentence and make people enjoy the sentences, because otherwise you can watch it on TV.
And also, I think, and orality becomes more important at this time too, and remembering that, and that, actually, there's a rise in people going to poetry readings, and there's a reason there are other ways that people might take things in, and it's important for us to remember that, and yeah.
I'm very optimistic. I have this unique experience of my entire professional life as a professor has been in startups. So the first startup was in Vancouver. I was a visiting scholar fresh out of graduate school. There was a new university opening up with new money for programs, but they had to be new and distinctive. And I actually managed to pitch a program in world literature. And everybody said, oh, here in Vancouver, our Persian immigrants want to be engineers, our Sikhs, they want to be doctors, and blah, 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 blah. And I, being Latin American myself and having felt a little excluded from the Anglophone canon as it was taught in English departments, I said, to quote a baseball movie, if you build it, they will come. Right? And what we did for this new campus on the outskirts of Vancouver was to have this world literature program that I founded and designed as the main program, the main composition English, not as a boutique separate program, but as the English department. And lo and behold, men and women are much more diverse, incredible, like this crowd or like the crowds in Jaipur, reflecting the full diversity of Vancouver for the first time in a literary classroom. And that's been my experience at NYU Abu Dhabi as well. I was hired there in part because of this experience of making a more inclusive literature classroom. So this experience in two startups makes me think, if we are inclusive as Z is, as your festival is, right? If we are more inclusive in the voices that we allow to take the stage, you will find that people will come. So that's my first reason for being optimistic. Regarding the competition from TV, I guess I'm slightly more pragmatic. Being at NYU, we have a film school, we have TV. There's a lot of commerce. We have the screenwriters, and frankly, most of the off-Broadway Tony Award winners I meet at NYU are making their living by writing for HBO. And I don't see it as a zero-sum game. I actually think that we benefit from the quality of their writing. And I don't mind that they're making $200,000 for an episode, or and they're writing good plays and good novels. And I don't know, the young people I meet, I seem to be able to transition between these two things. So I don't think that necessarily, in my own teaching, I use interactive storytelling, and I let them use software to design, choose your own adventure stories or whatever turns them on. I don't think that takes away from their ability to write a good novel. So I'm actually optimistic about this commerce, if I may say so.
So on that note, I think we open it up to the audience. Are there any questions? We don't have a mic, so you'll just have to, this one can't come so far.
Yeah.
Maybe you and then you, loud and clear.
I myself speak several languages, and I have found, based on the title of the sessions, words are all we have, that the reality of language is actually not words, but it is the meaning that's conferred through from a culture. So similar to Kanishk, what you were reading. So my question perhaps for all of you is, how do we, in a world literature or other sense, how do we bring the meaning that comes from other cultures and other languages into a different language, into a different culture, so that it can resonate? Because for me, it's not about knowing that bread is kana or pan or whatever language, but it's much more, the emotional and other realities. So that's my question.
Should we take one more question? Because sometimes two questions, so you could give yours as well, and sometimes the answers resonate.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about your understandings of the sacredness of language and its inner origin. And it has so much to do, Mr. Tharoor, with the loss of these ancient languages, and original languages. I was an ESL teacher for 9 years, and I studied for my master's language loss, especially among Spanish-speaking indigenous people from the Americas coming here. And what I guess I'm asking about in terms of each of your types of writing, how do you see the reflective and inner nature of language that is so much present in those ancient languages versus the quantitative, task-oriented, goal-oriented selling language of today?
Okay, so the two questions are in fact related, because she's asking about how do you return the meaning through other languages to words, and you are talking about the sacred origins of language. We'll take your question next. And again, the same themes. Which of you would like to begin? I think Kanishk.
Well, to the first question, I really think it's incredibly important for people in this country and every country to read much more in translation. I've been thinking about my reading in the last 10 years. I think I've probably read much more in translation than I've read of work originally written in English, and I found that for me incredibly nourishing. I think there's a website. I think it's called 2% or 3%. 3%, right? That 3% of what people read in the United States is in translation or from outside the U.S. And that means that there's so much of the way people are dealing with literature here is so narrow, and I think that has also a sort of negative effect on the kinds of writing that are sometimes produced within this literary tradition. So I do think that's one thing, that it's incumbent upon us to try harder to read in translation. And there's so many great books out there, and so many places you can find good books in translation. With the question of sacredness, I wish I'm fairly, how do I say, I'm fairly agnostic So the idea of I don't know how to really wrap my head around the idea of the sacredness in sort of immanent in language, but I do find for me that that reading sort of pre-modern writing is often really a source of pleasure and again a resource for me. So I read a lot of ancient texts. Whether it's Persian medieval poems or epics or even collections of folklore, and I find that when I'm writing fiction, the sort of modern form of fiction in the 21st century, that having that sort of reservoir is really freeing, and I like to think that my stories are sort of flecked by a kind of older firelight of the storyteller, and. So I do feel that, not only should we read in translation, but we should also open ourselves up to the past a bit more.
I echo that. And also, I wanted to, maybe I wouldn't think so much about the sacred aspect of a word, but I certainly would think about its emotional power that doesn't have to do with the cognition of the word, but the experience of the sound of the word. So if we hear lots of or lots of or lots of we have different bodily experiences with each of those sounds, and we don't always even know that we're having an affective experience of language. That is part of the sacred and the incantatory and the spell possibility of language that is so, so powerful. And of course, many of you probably know that, the linguist de Saussure's notion that the relationship between a word and the object it indicates out in the world is completely random. And so when we have tree and we have arbre and we have dendro and all these different words, that it's a random relationship. And yet, recently, there's what's called the Buba Kiki effect. So if I make this shape versus this shape, which is Buba and which is Kiki? Which is this Buba? Yeah. So actually, it's kind of amazing. We all, and we can say that in any language. They've discovered that many language speakers will find this is Kiki and this is Buba. Yeah. And that is so. I mean, there's the magic of sound, actually. And they've even done these tests where they've played bird songs, say from Papua New Guinea, and given a list of words that these birds might be called. And people in different language speakers will recognize the Papua New Guinea word for that bird. So that's what I want to say. And also that one of the things they've discovered is that species disappear in relation to languages disappearing.
I want to just say something because it will resonate with something she said, which was very exciting. And I tend to think of myself as a religious person, but I can never tell whether I'm really religious or whether it is that poetry, the incantatory poetry, that takes me to a certain place. And in the Hindu scriptures, there is a series of sounds which are called Bij mantra. And these are sounds which are mantras or protective words, but they have no meaning. They invoke certain things, they are used for certain gods, but they have no meaning. And I have tried to study a little more about them, but I haven't got very far. I know which ones mean what. I don't know why, and I use them. So it is about sound, as you said, and words. Now, please follow. Sorry to have interrupted this.
Well, no, please. I'm glad you answered the note of extinction of languages and of species. I was actually wondering if we could gather a few more questions. Maybe I'll get a chance to answer one of them. Some quick questions, so at least we have a sense of what people were thinking.
What about yours, right there?
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, just as our own language, we've seen even in our own language, there's this mingling of languages. They all kind of seem to come together, and we've been losing languages. And even in our own language, we've started to lose words over time. And I was just wondering, how do you see our language, various languages around the world, how do you see the future of language?
And
Paulo, that's yours.
could we just collect a couple
Yes,
more questions? A few more just so we have a sense of things.
So I'm a spelling bee kid. One of those spelling bee kids. And the reason my parents are immigrants and they thought you learn the history of a language I have a biracial, multiracial, multicultural family. I'm trying to think for my daughter, how do I do that in reverse for her with Punjabi? And what do I do for her in that way? But then I struggle with this question of, is there a moral struggle when it comes to trying to shape her identity? Because truly, she's growing up in this country. Her language is whatever it will be. She may become a heritage speaker by choice. But is there something ethically to consider about trying to push her into learning about these cultures? She's 2. And push her into having to understand these things.
So my question is, you talked about the media and the relationship between media, literature, and text. And so something that I'm really interested in, sorry I'm not promoting this issue, something I'm really interested in is how can we as writers in media proliferate or promote literature and learning and reading text critically?
So my question is about the technology's impact on language, with artificial intelligence. Now computer can write some of the articles used to be written by humans, like financial articles, sports reports. We really have been seeing a dumbing down or simplification of languages. Are we going that way? Is it good or bad? If it's bad, how can we make people aware or hold it from that way?
Wow, that's a lot to take in. I do think that the one area where the startups in San Francisco have not yet figured out is the haiku, the sonnet, the poem, the Old English ballad cannot be processed in the same way as you say as a sports report and whether Manchester City scored 2 goals against United or something like that. So I think maybe what we're doing is distinctive enough and rich enough for that. You both ask very probing questions. I'm actually, I can sympathize with yours because my kids are speaking English and I wonder how much Portuguese and Spanish I should force upon them, right? All I can do is try and spend time there and hope that they make friends and pick it up organically, because I in a way I share your ambiguity, about doing it in the abstract. I do think that the stories of the Arabian Nights, because they were oral stories, do remind us that that's how most tradition has passed throughout history. And I think that has survived technology. I don't think that families are yet done telling their children these stories.
I feel the resonance of your question. My wife is Puerto Rican, and when we have kids, we're going to be raising them with a welter of languages, and or at least trying to. But
so easy to say.
I know. Well, seriously, this is why I almost.
And then they'll learn Old English when they're 7.
Oh yeah, definitely. Actually, in fact, I should already begin speaking it. Just to saturate the world. But I think almost more than language, this is what I tell myself when I'm thinking about this potential future. That I think that with our multiracial kids or multicultural kids, whatever you want to call them, that they should be able to switch frames of reference. So whether or not they speak fluent Punjabi, that they should that sense of being, say, at home in presumably you live in the U.S., so somewhere in the U.S., and yet also having enough knowledge about India, about the history of India, about Indian culture, politics, etc., that they don't feel a jarring sense of alienness from that world. And that actually doesn't have to do with language necessarily. Obviously, language would help. But it's more about, I think what we need is more people who can switch frames of reference. That, again, I had a very particular kind of upbringing, a very fortunate upbringing in many ways. But the sort of one of the greatest inheritances I've had is I think the number of frames of references I can inhabit. And I hope that's what I can pass down to my kids as well. Inshallah.
On that note, I'm afraid we've got the sign